So we'll get started in a moment. We are recording this webinar, and we will obviously make that available afterwards as well. So as people start to join, I'm just going to kick us off with a kind of welcome to our first Unlocking Effective Evaluation webinar. So this is going to be the first of a series that will run into the new year after Christmas. And today we're going to talk to you about pre and post test design. So how to use your existing survey data. So to introduce ourselves quickly, I am Rain Sherlock. So I'm the evaluation manager here at TASO. And I'm just going to hand you over to each of my colleagues to quickly introduce themselves. Zara, would you like to?
Hi, so my name is Zara. I'm a research officer at TASO, and I mostly work on the evaluation side.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, just interrupted you there, Rain. Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah, and I'm also a research officer at TASO, but more on the research than the evaluation side. Nice to have you all here.
Fantastic. Thank you both. So just to give you a quick overview of our session today, I'm going to give you a real brief reminder of TASO, who we are and what we do. Zara is then going to speak to you about a kind of introduction to the method that we're going through today. So she'll give you some theoretical examples of a pre-test, post-test design. And then we're going to move on to Sarah, who's going to talk you through a much more practical and applied example of how to use this design. As I said a moment ago, we will have time for questions at the end. So if you could all pop your questions in the Q&A box as we go through and not the chat box, if that's okay. So by way of a quick intro to TASO, as many of you may know by now, we're an independent hub for education professionals, and we're here to support the sector. So we produce a lot of kind of advice and guidance and toolkits. And we're hoping to both work with you and also learn from you as we produce this research and evaluation. We are also an independent charity. We were set up by a consortium and we spun out to become independent in April of this year, actually, so relatively recently. And we're an affiliate What Works centre. So there are about 9 of these centres that are all designed to help inform government using evidence to make sure that we build policies and practice based on what works. And then finally, you can see at the bottom there that we're currently funded by the Office for Students as well. So I wanted to just quickly kind of situate this session, I guess, in TASO's overall evaluation cycle. This slide may be familiar to some of you by now. We tend to use it quite a lot when speaking about how TASO approaches evaluation. And one of the things that the kind of circular design on the slide indicates is that we very much think of evaluation as reiterative at TASO. So each of these individual 4 stages should inform the next phase in your cycle. And today we're situated within the plan phase. So we're going to be talking about research design and methodology. And then obviously within that, focused on pre and post test design. So I can see that a couple of people have joined in the last moment. I'm now just given a quick intro to the session and we're now going to kick off. So I'm going to hand over to Zara, who's going to give you a theoretical approach to pre and post test evaluation.
Thank you, Rain. So in the first part of this webinar, we will provide a theoretical approach to pre-test post-test design. So I will start with an introductory example where I will ask each of you to grab a pen and a paper. And on a piece of paper, I will ask you to rate your current level of happiness following this Likert scale that goes between 1 and 7. I just want to add a disclaimer. This is not a validated scale because validated happiness scale generally contains many items and obviously it would take too long. So I will just leave you a few seconds to write your level of happiness. Thank you. Now I want you to look at these cute puppy pictures for a little bit. Okay. And now I will ask you to reflect and write down 3 adjectives that best describe what you just saw. So Okay, and now, once again, I want you to rate your current level of happiness on the Likert scale. So, as you probably guessed, my example aimed at showing you how pretest-posttest design can be used to evaluate the impact of an intervention on an outcome of interest. Here, I made you look at cute puppy pictures and reflect on this experience in order to evaluate the impact on your self-reported level of happiness. So that brings us to a central question: what is a pretest-posttest design? A pretest-posttest design is also called before and after design. It's a widely used evaluation method, which is adopted in many fields of research, notably higher education research, as we will see throughout this presentation. As the name indicates, pretest-posttest design requires two measurements of one or multiple variables of interest for each individual. So it starts with a pretest or baseline measure that is administered before administrating the treatment, and then a post-test measure after the treatment has occurred. And this allows researchers to evaluate whether the outcomes have changed over time for participants. So there are multiple challenges. First of all, you might obtain biased results if you fail to control for every individual characteristic or unobservable factor influencing your participants' response. For example, maybe some of you work from home and maybe you have your own puppy sitting next to you during the day. So in a way, you have already been partially exposed to the intervention even before the pretest measurement. So in this case, the measurement is likely to be biased. Secondly, in a pretest-posttest design, it is assumed that nothing has changed between the two measurements apart from the exposure to the intervention. And obviously, it is not a realistic assumption, particularly when the intervention takes place over a long time frame. Third, the study time frame can also cause attrition problems. So if too many participants drop out of the study before the post-test measurements, or if there is a disproportionate proportion of participants dropping out from a particular group, and attrition can cause bias, or it can even make the analysis impossible if the number of complete observations is not large enough to perform the statistical test. And finally, the only outcome that can be measured are those who can be collected at multiple time points, such as grade or attitudes. So for this section, we're going to take an example using an intervention that most of you should be familiar with, named Information, Advice, and Guidance, IAG. This refers to a pre-entry intervention that helps students make more informed decisions about their education options. So we're going to imagine that we are presenting different options for pretest-posttest design to a higher education provider who is hoping to evaluate an IAG intervention that they are trialing in a local school. And the provider is hoping to evaluate whether the intervention affects student aspirations and attitudes towards higher education. If you want more information on the existing evidence on the topic, I will refer you to the toolkit page that we have on the TASO website. So the first and simplest design option for pretest-posttest is non-random assignment and no comparison group. So in our example, it corresponds to a situation where everyone in the school participates in the session and they all fill out the pretest and the posttest survey. But obviously with this design, the results are likely to be biased because there is no comparison group and no randomization. So the second option is to add a non-random comparison group. So in addition to the treatment group which received the intervention, we add one or multiple control groups that do not receive the intervention, but they still participate in the pretest and the post-test. So for instance, in our example, it could mean that one class A has access to the session, so they are the treatment group, whereas the other class B, doesn't, and they are the control group. It could also be a situation where we let students decide whether they want to receive the information and guidance on higher education. And those who are not interested will be part of the control group, whereas those who are interested will be part of the treatment. Adding a control group allows researchers to have a baseline, and thus it ensures that the difference between the pretest and the post-test are independent from the evaluation process itself or other events that might be occurring between the pretest and the post-test. For example, you might have heard of a bias called the Hawthorne effect. It corresponds to a change of behavior or perception that occurs in the population of interest just because the individual know that they are being observed and evaluated. So in our context, it could mean that if knowing that the researcher care about the aspiration related to HE, receiving the test could be enough to encourage the students at the school to develop an increased interest and knowledge of higher education independently from the intervention. And using a non-random comparison group eliminates this bias. So the third and more elaborate option requires adding a random comparison group. So it is the same protocol as the one we just explained, except that the assignment to a group, control, or treatment is randomized. So importantly, it means that we do not let the students or their parents, for example, choose whether they want to take part of the intervention or not. Instead, it is researchers who create the groups using randomization tools. Obviously, this design choice can have important ethical implications, so it needs to be carefully considered. Furthermore, randomizing the group is not enough. To ensure that the randomization has been correctly done, it has to be checked to make sure that the group have on average similar characteristics. And if the sample size is large enough and it is correctly randomized, then the group created should be on average similar regarding not only their visible, but also their invisible characteristics. For example, a group of students receiving the intervention should have the same gender repartition as and the same academic capacity as the control group. If we want to use a technical language, we would say that the process of randomizations allows us to rule out visible and invisible confounding factors. This methodology further decreases the likelihood of obtaining biased results. This way of doing a pretest post-test design also corresponds to what we call a randomized control trial. So if we want to compare the situation to that of a non-randomized control group, it is easy to understand where the bias might come from. For example, if it is up to the parents or students to choose whether they want to receive advice and information on higher education, it is almost certain that the type of student who will decide to opt out of the intervention would be different from the ones who would choose to attend. So for example, those who opt out might be less interested in higher education to begin with. Importantly, even with the randomization, it is not possible to generalize the results of a pretest post-test study to other groups or other settings than the ones where the evaluation occurred. Finally, you can use multiple treatment group aggregated. So it means that you have different groups who receive the same intervention or a similar one in different settings, and you aggregate those groups to obtain an estimation of the average effect of the intervention on the groups. So this is what we will talk about in the upcoming summer school example that will be presented by Sarah, meaning that instead of just measuring the variables for one group, you're doing for multiple groups and you aggregate the data to obtain a general results. So using the OFS standard of evidence, the data collected using a pretest post-test design can contribute to designing either a type 2 or a type 3 study. As a reminder, type 2 corresponds to empirical inquiry, whereas type 3 corresponds to causality. So if the design contains a randomized comparison group, it might be a type 3, otherwise it might be a type 2. But it is important to remember that a design choice is not sufficient to obtain a certain type of evidence because many other factors come into play. Now, I will finally briefly introduce you to the principle of statistical analysis related to pretest and post-test data. It is a crucial step to obtain valid and reliable results and to maximize research quality. It is really important to choose the right test and to consider the associated assumptions. because otherwise the results might misrepresent the data, and researchers might end up making false claims, which is obviously very problematic. In general terms, the statistical analysis of pretest-posttest data is aimed at precisely measuring the distance traveled by the participants between a point A and a point B, so between pretest and post-test, and we're looking specifically at changes in the outcome of interest. However, we should be aware that looking at the pretest-posttest differences doesn't allow us to understand how the intervention has impacted the outcome. The mechanism driving the change observed remain invisible to the researchers using a pretest-posttest analysis. This is why this invisible middle part is what we call the black box of evaluation. But we can use complementary research methods such as meta-analysis or mechanism experiments observations, for example, to uncover these invisible parts. So as I started talking about before, there are different types of statistical tests that are available to understand what the effect of intervention is using pretest-posttest data. So in this presentation, we'll focus more on the t-test because it is the simplest type of test, but there are also others that exist. So two of them are the analysis of covariance, ANCOVA, and the multiple linear regression. The two last ones are more complex, so we'll not go into them during this presentation. Although I will not go into details into what the characteristics of those tests are and how you can apply them, I will let Sarah continue and present a practical example using a t-test.
Still takes me too long to unmute myself, sorry. Thanks so much, Zara. So Zara's just provided sort of the theoretical background and why we would use this sort of analysis. And now I just want to illustrate how we're actually using this type of analysis at the moment in one of our projects. So I'm just going to give you a bit of background on the project to start with, and then go into more in the methods and how we're using pre-test, post-test analysis. So as some of you might be aware, we're currently doing a summer schools evaluation. So we're evaluating the impact of university summer schools that took place in the summer of 2021. So they've just happened. And the main aim of these summer schools is to increase progression to HE, so to higher education for students from disadvantaged groups or from underrepresented groups. So obviously this is our main aim of our widening participation outreach activity. So that's not to say that different aims don't exist. You might have more short-term aims related to skills or a sense of belonging, but ultimately we want to increase progression and widen participation in higher education. So TASO commissioned an evidence review in 2019 to look at what sort of existing evidence there is on summer schools. And they show that summer schools are associated or correlated with an increase in confidence and aspirations related to higher education, which is obviously really positive. But what these evidence reviews are lacking, or what the evidence is lacking, is linking summer schools to HE enrollment rates. So we're missing this link to behavioural outcomes. So it's great that aspirations and confidence are more positive, but we don't actually know if this then leads to progression to HE and to widening participation. What we're also lacking, which really speaks to what Zara has gone over in her examples, is that we don't have this causal evidence. So on the whole, we've just got correlational evidence. We're not looking at comparison groups or control groups. So we're really missing that sort of causal evidence, which is where TASO come in. So for our summer schools evaluation, we've got 8 lovely partner universities with us. 4 of them are running pre-16 summer schools, so they're aimed at year 9 or year 10. And then we've also got 4 post-16 summer schools. So these will be with year 12 students or your first year of post-16 education. So these summer schools, as you might well be familiar with, a lot of your outreach activities are generally oversubscribed. So this means the number of applicants that we have is much larger than the number of spaces available on the summer school. And this allows us to do a randomized controlled trial, also known as an RCT. So quite often universities might use some sort of ranking system to see which criteria students meet in order to fill the places. But for this evaluation, instead, we randomly allocate places. So we have a long list of eligible applicants that meet some sort of widening participation criteria, and these students are randomly allocated to either receive a place, and that's known as our treatment group, or they don't receive a place, and that's known as our control group. And as Zara said earlier, the good thing about this randomization, is that we can make sure the groups are balanced. So with these visible characteristics such as gender and ethnicity, but also invisible characteristics, so individual motivation or parental engagement, we can make sure, because it's completely random, that these groups are balanced. So we can actually measure the outcomes, and we can look at the difference in outcomes between our treatment and our control groups. And this then gives us a causal estimate. So it gives us this causal evidence, this type 3 evidence that we're really lacking. And there's two main bits of outcome data that we're collecting for this project. The first is attitudes to HE, or aspirations to do with HE, and this is collected via a survey. So this is a good short-term measure and a proxy measure of a sort of behavioural outcome, which is our enrolment in higher education. And that's done through the Higher Education Access Tracker, which I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with. So we can actually track in the long term whether students do enter HE, and we can compare that for our treatment and control groups. So that's a bit of a background on the actual project. But because of COVID-19 and the pandemic, as you're all aware, unfortunately, things haven't gone to plan with this project. And the main thing that it's impacted is it means that our summer schools have had to go online, which I'm sure you're all familiar with your outreach activity having to be delivered online over the last year or two. So this obviously has benefits. So for example, online summer schools mean you can have more students that participate. It means that students that live hundreds of miles away can go to your summer school and don't have to worry about traveling to your university campus. So there's obviously a lot of great things to do with online summer schools, but it does put us at a bit of a disadvantage because we're no longer evaluating a known intervention. We're not evaluating something that these universities have run for years that includes a residential element that they've planned and know what they're doing. Instead, we're evaluating something that's relatively new that they haven't done before, perhaps, and using new platforms and trying out new things. So it's exciting to be in a project that's quite new in this way, but it does mean we're not evaluating this sort of known intervention. What else hasn't gone to plan is that the applicant numbers are significantly down. So again, this is probably likely due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We might find that students have had to have their school curriculum online for so long, so they really don't want to be attending an online summer school. We can't be sure that those are the reasons, but that's quite likely. So it does mean that 4 of our universities, so half of our partner universities, haven't actually had enough applicants to be able to participate in our randomized controlled trial. So if you remember from a few slides ago, we needed to have enough applicants so that we could randomize them into either a treatment group or a control group. So we needed the number of applicants to be greater than the number of places available. But this hasn't actually been the case for 4 of our partner universities, and it means that all of their applicants have been offered a place. So we've essentially just got a treatment group. We don't have this comparator group. So it means they can't participate in our RCT. So we've had to go to plan B for these 4 universities, and that's where pretest-posttest analysis comes in. So I mentioned that our sort of primary measure is enrolment into HE, so looking at this behavioural outcome, but what we're also doing is collecting this survey data. So we were always going to collect this survey data before the summer school actually happened. So this is our pre-test measure. And also we've collected survey data again after the summer school. So this is our post-test measure. So we were already doing this anyway, so why not do pre-test post-test analysis? And as Zara sort of covered in her introduction, we'll be able to see the distance traveled in student responses from before the summer school to after the summer school. And as Zara said, there's a few different ways that you can actually conduct this sort of analysis that range from the more simple to the more complex. And the type of analysis that we'll be doing for this project is called a paired t-test. And it's called a paired t-test because our measurements are paired. So for example, let's imagine Zara and I go back in time and we are young enough to attend a summer school. So what we would do is I would take a survey before the summer school. I'd then attend the summer school and then I'd take the survey again after. So that means we've got a paired measurement for myself and we'd have exactly the same for Zara. So what this paired t-test will do, it will look whether there is statistical evidence that the mean difference between these paired measurements is significantly different from 0. So ideally what we want is to be able to find out whether our post-summer school survey scores are significantly higher than our pre-summer school survey scores. So that's what a paired t-test will find out. And obviously if it is 0 between our pre-summer school and our post-summer school scores, it means that there hasn't really been a change in our attitudes towards HE as a result of the summer school. So that's what our paired t-test will help us find out. So I'm just going to show you some of the survey questions that we're actually using for this project. So on the whole, we're looking at their likelihood of applying to university. So obviously this is a bit of a proxy measure. Hopefully that will show us who's looking to apply, and we can then look at this in the actual behavioural measure when we do our long-term tracking through HEAT. We're looking at confidence, so how confident students are pre-entry and post-entry. Also a sort of sense of belonging measure, whether they feel like university is for them. And also their perception of any barriers in the way of sort of student finance and knowing how to apply. So ideally, we want the scores on these surveys to be significantly greater after the summer school, because it's then hopefully showing that our summer school is doing the right things. So just to make this really clear, I'm just going to apply this to one of our survey questions. So the first survey question, how likely are you to apply to university? So responses here go from scoring a 1, which is extremely likely, to a 7, which is extremely likely. So if you're scoring it low, you're showing that you don't really feel like you're going to apply to university. Whereas if you're scoring it high, you're feeling like you will go. And if you score at around a 4, it means you're feeling quite neutral about university at this point. So going back to myself and Zara. So pre-summer school, I might score this survey question at a 3. So I'm saying at the moment, I'm not really sure about going to university. I'm quite unlikely to apply. Zara, on the other hand, has scored a 5. So at the moment, she feels like she's quite likely to apply to university. We then attend our summer school and we then do our post-summer school survey. So we can see that I've changed my answer now to a 5. So I feel like I am actually quite likely to apply to university. And Zara's even more sure. She knows she's extremely likely to apply. There's no doubt in her mind here she wants to apply to university. So on the surface, if we have a look at these scores, we might say on average our pre-summer school scores are around about a 4. So it seems quite neutral that students feel about university. Whereas after the summer school, we're looking at an average score of around 6. So it's looking more likely that students are applying to university. So previously you might have left it there and you might have said, great, on average scores are higher post-summer school. But that's what we want to change. So we want to make sure that WP teams are doing some sort of statistical analysis just to make sure that this difference is significant. And that's what a paired t-test will do. It will look at the difference in pre and post summer school scores for each student, so for each pair of student, and obviously we hope on your summer schools you've got more than just me and Zara there, and it will show whether it's significantly different from 0. So we'll be able to see whether students did actually feel more interested or more likely to apply to university after the summer school. So in terms of our sample, as I said, we've got 4 different universities that are participating in what we're calling a sub-project. So it's like a little spin-off from the main project, the main RCT. And as you can see, they do differ slightly in terms of their sample size. So University D has got quite a large sample, whereas University A to C has got a slightly smaller sample. And sample size does matter. So we have to be careful when we're doing this sort of analysis on different sample size. So just to illustrate this, what we do when we're doing statistical testing is trying to look at, trying to prove or disprove our null hypothesis. So your null hypothesis might be something you've heard of, but it's your sort of default hypothesis stating that there will be no difference. So for this sub-project, our null hypothesis here is that there will be no difference between pre and post summer school scores. So this isn't what we really want to happen, and this is what we want is to be able to reject a false null hypothesis. So we really want to try and find a true difference between our pre and post summer school scores. So if we've got quite a large sample size, and if we increase the sample size, it actually increases the sensitivity of our statistical test. So it makes it more likely that we'll find a true difference between our pre and post summer school scores if there is indeed a difference there. On the other hand, though, if we've got quite a small sample size, due to sampling error, it's unlikely to accurately represent your true population. And this means we increase the chance of making something called a false negative. So we're stating that there'll be no difference between our pre and post summer school scores when actually a difference does exist. So we're making a false negative, and this is also called a type 2 error, which you might as well have heard of. So if we've got a small sample size, we're just increasing the chance of making that type 2 error. So I'm just going to try and illustrate it further with quite a random example that has nothing to do with widening participation, or I hope anyway, looking at fish in the sea. So our default, our null hypothesis is that there are no fish in the sea. So this is what we're trying to prove or disprove. And I'm just going to ask whether there's any fish in the sea. And I'm going to first have a really small sample. So I'm going to take my bucket and go down to Brighton and go into the sea and pull up a bucket of seawater. And I find that there's no fish in my bucket. So if I'm just going to look at this sample alone, I would assume then that my null hypothesis is correct and that there isn't any fish in the sea. So I'm hoping that you can see here that I would be making a false negative or a type 2 error. I'd be saying that there's no fish in the sea when we all know at the moment there is actually lots of fish in the sea. Let's change this now to a really large sample size. So I'm going to do buckets and buckets of water, loads and loads of water. And I find when I take more buckets of water that I do actually find fish in the sea. So some of my buckets are pulling up fish. So with my large sample size, I can see that our null hypothesis is false and that there are actually fish in the sea. So if we go back to our summer school example, hopefully you can see that when we have smaller sample sizes, we just need to be careful because it's less likely to accurately represent the true population, so the wider population. So it does mean with small sample sizes, we're more likely to make something called a false negative. So we're more likely to say that there's no difference between our pre and post summer school student responses when in fact there is a difference, there is a true difference, we've just missed it. So what TASO sort of trying to combat here with this sub-project is that universities are going to do their own sort of paired t-tests locally, so that in some cases they can get an experience of using this sort of type of analysis. But what they're also going to do is send the data through to TASO. So it means we can carry out aggregate analysis. So Zara alluded to this earlier, that we're going to do sort of aggregate analysis at different universities. So we're going to get all of the data together, which gives us a much larger sample, and then carry out the analysis there. And then we can be more confident in what we're seeing, and that we're seeing a true difference if there is indeed one. So what our analysis can't tell us. So this links back to the challenges that Zara explained earlier on. So obviously it's worth saying that this is a plan B, our sub-project. It's not what we wanted to do in the first place. We obviously wanted to run a randomized controlled trial and make sure we had a comparator group. But this didn't go to plan, so we're just making the best of the situation. So as Zara alluded to earlier, what this analysis is assuming is that if the summer school didn't exist, the outcome for students would be exactly the same. So in other words, their attitudes to university would remain exactly the same. But of course, we don't know if that's the case, because we can't control external factors. So we don't know if the summer school is the reason why attitudes to university might become more positive. It might be that students have attended some sort of workshops in school that have gone through university. It might be that their sibling has recently gone to university, or that their parents have become more engaged with university. There's lots of different things that could have happened here. And because we're not controlling those different factors, we can't be sure that the summer school was the thing that changed the attitudes. So we're lacking causal evidence, or type 3 evidence. And this is why our RCT is really important. This is what we were trying to gain in the first place. So with our RCT, we are controlling external variables, or basically our treatment and control group are being exposed to similar external variables. And because they're balanced groups, the only true difference between them is that one is attending a summer school and one group isn't. So it does mean that we can be more confident that it's the summer schools that will have caused the change in outcomes rather than anything else. But that's not to say that this pre-test post-test analysis that we're doing isn't a good thing to do. It's still really useful. It's still going to give us some indication of changes in attitudes as a result of the summer school. And to be honest, it's probably data that you're already collecting. So it's a great thing to do with data that you will already have. You're likely already collecting survey responses before and after your intervention. And another thing that's quite good, as Zara mentioned, is that you can actually combine your pre-test post-test analysis with other types of research or other types of data. So for example, you might do some interviews or some focus groups with your students. So that's exactly what's happening on our summer school evaluation. So even though some of our universities aren't taking part in the RCT, they're still doing something called the implementation and process evaluation. So that means they're really delving into what happened with the summer school, why attitudes were changed if they were, and they're doing focus groups and interviews with students and trying to find out what actually happened. And this can really be useful to then back up your survey data analysis, your pre-test post-test analysis that you're doing. Which brings me to the end of my presentation. So I'm just going to hand back over to Rain now for questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and also Zara for your presentation. So I can see we've got a lot of questions in the Q&A box. We're going to make our way through and answer as many as we can in the next kind of 15 minutes or so. We won't keep you past 12. Just to say up front, if anyone has a question that they've put in the box that we don't get to, or hasn't had a chance to ask a question, please do also feel free to email us, and we will try and get back to anyone who needed more advice on a question that was unanswered. I'm actually going to give Sarah and Zara a breather. I'm going to answer one question up front that seems to be featuring in a number of different questions asked, and this is the idea of sharing validated survey scales with the sector, and particularly those that are working closest with these interventions, so kind of WP and student success practitioners. And I'm going to say that we are at the moment in the process of commissioning a new project at TASO that's going to be a survey validation project. So what we will do, it will be a 12-month process, and we're going to be designing banks of survey items that will make up subscales to ask some of these really important questions around things like confidence, self-efficacy, sense of belonging. So at the moment, we understand that there's quite a lot of variation in the types of questions that people use, and that often people are using unvalidated scales because that's the best that we have available to us right now. And we're hoping to tackle that. And of course, all of those scales would be made available to the sector. It takes a little while. The process of validating questionnaires is quite long. We need to test them with different age groups to make sure that the reading ages are appropriate. Also for students with English as a second language. But by about this time next year, we're hoping to have a draft questionnaire that is bespoke for the sector to ask some of these constructs. So kind of watch this space, I guess, but we don't have a validated version to share with you right now. So to start making our way through the questions, and I might group these together as I go to try and answer as many as possible. So we have a few questions on the idea of attrition generally. So how do we make sure that we get survey responses for both treatment and control, if we have a control group, and then also for both the pre-test point and the post-test point. This is something that we've talked about a lot at TASO, as I'm sure all of you have in your teams, and it is a real challenge. One of the things we've been discussing recently is the idea of incentives and compensation for people's time. So both Sarah and Zara, do either of you have a kind of response to what we could do to try and reduce the risk of high attrition?
Yeah, sure. Happy to take this. Yeah, as Rain said, it's a real challenge. We've got all of our survey data back from our summer school evaluation at the moment, and we're looking at about a 60% response rate. So it is indeed a challenge, and something which we're trying to address actually in some ethics guidance that TASO will be producing in the new year as well. And yeah, as Rain says, incentives or compensation, it can be a good idea. So for instance, having a prize draw for students to ensure that they feel like they're compensated for their time to fill out a survey. Something that works quite effectively as well is just using the last day of your intervention or your summer school to do the actual survey. Obviously that's great for your treatment group, but obviously if you have got a control or a comparator group that weren't attending your intervention, then that does make it more difficult. What we did to ensure that we got a really high response rate pre-intervention was making the survey questions part of the application form to the summer school. So this really ensured that students did complete the survey. But of course, that's subject to some biases as well. So it is really tricky. And I realise I haven't been extremely helpful in answering your question there. But yeah, we do appreciate it's tricky, and just making sure you would compensate students for their time and just explaining to them sort of why this survey is really useful for sort of improving your interventions as well.
Thank you, Sarah. And then Zara, I think this question is maybe best placed for you, and it's a question that has come up in various formats, I think maybe 5+ times. And this is the idea of how many points we should have on a Likert scale. So there's a lot of questions around whether it's best to have an even number, so a 4-point scale, or an odd number like a 5 or 7-point scale. And then within that, is it better to have 5 points or 7 points? And Zara has recently done some work on this, so she might be able to give you some more information.
Sorry, I struggled a little bit to unmute myself. Thank you, Rain, for this question. So yes, I have done, actually, we have published a page on our website all about Likert scales and how to design them. I am going to say that unfortunately, we don't have a perfect answer to that question of how many points you should put and whether you should include or not include a midpoint. So I would say it really depends on what you are doing. It depends both on who is your sample. So for example, younger students, you would prefer to put a lower number of points on the Likert scale, whereas like older students and adults, you would feel more comfortable putting a higher number. But you should always be careful to put enough answers. If possible, you should put one for each point. So like I did with the introductory example, I put really not happy, quite happy. You really need to put those answers to make sure that people are just not just randomly choosing a number, but they really know what it corresponds to. Regarding the midpoint, it depends as well on what type of statistical analysis you are planning on doing. So I would refer you to the page that we have published for more information on that. But I would also say that asking someone if you really want an exact answer for your particular case, I would ask someone who is well versed in statistical analysis to make sure that you are doing the best for your particular question, I guess.
I just wanted to add to that as well. You might have noticed for the example that I went through that we had 7 points on the scale, and this is something we actually thought about for that question quite a lot, because generally when students that apply to a summer school, you could probably assume that they're already quite interested in higher education and are already quite likely to apply. So we did find, even with our pre-summer school surveys, that students were already scoring that question quite high. So it was just important to us that we had as many points as possible, so 7 points on our scale rather than 5, so that we could really try and pick apart perhaps between quite likely to apply and extremely likely to apply. And we'd hopefully see that difference between pre and post a bit more.
Great, thank you both. So another topic that we have had multiple questions on is the idea of RCTs generally. Of course, this webinar isn't covering RCTs specifically, but the summer school example that Sarah spoke about was initially designed as an RCT, so there is some overlap. I think there's two components that seem to be coming up consistently in the question box. One is broadly, and I'm definitely paraphrasing, but how can we justify randomizing if it means that some students don't receive the treatment? And I think this question was asked actually before Sarah got to it in her presentation. But perhaps, Sarah, you could explain a little bit more about how some schools are oversubscribed.
Yes, of course. Yeah. This is obviously something that comes up quite a lot in sort of explaining our projects. And yeah, the way the RCT is enabled to work is because we do have this oversubscription for our interventions. So we can see from this sub-project that from when some summer schools weren't oversubscribed, so the applicant numbers were either less or the same as the number of places, we just weren't able to do that randomization. So it's not like we cut the places there and sort of enforced a randomization. We just had to say it wasn't possible for this point. But for generally speaking, so for most of your outreach activity, you might find that you get a lot more applicants than the number of places available. And like I said, perhaps previously you might have done a ranking system to try and see who you thought deserved a place. Perhaps they met more WP criteria than others. But for a randomized controlled trial, you'll instead have this sort of long list of applicants, and their place is just decided randomly. So it's only possible because it's oversubscribed and not all students are able to get a place anyway. But I have seen quite a lot of questions as well on sort of the ethics of this and whether students are informed of this. And yeah, just to reassure you that this project did go through a really rigorous ethical approval with King's College London, and it was, yeah, obviously all students were made aware that when they're applying to the summer school, that the summer school was part of a research project and that their place was going to be determined by random allocation. So they were aware of this. They had participant information sheets, they had consent forms, and we also produced a video to try and explain the methods to them so they could be really clear what their involvement in this project would mean. And that's something you've got to be really, need to really make sure you're doing all this as part of an RCT to make sure students understand what it means to be a part of it.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So another area that we have quite a lot of questions on is sampling and sample size. I think to pick out two kind of specific elements of the general questions on sampling, there's a couple of people asking, again, Sarah, sorry to come to you, but you're definitely most familiar with the summer school example. Of the higher education providers that were able to continue to take part in the overall randomized control trial, how many participants did they have to have, or how many students did they have to have?
I'm so sorry, Rain. I think my internet cut out then, so I missed part of your question. Would you be able to just repeat that?
Of course, not to worry. There's just some questions asking about for the schools or the providers that were able to continue to take part in the RCT for the summer school. How many students did they have?
Okay, thank you. So it did vary. A lot of people will think that to participate in a randomized control trial that you need to have an equal size treatment and control group. And of course, our sort of illustrations or little icons as part of this presentation, we do have balanced groups. So that's why you might be under that illusion, but obviously it doesn't matter if there is uneven groups. So for some of our universities participating, they might have had 70 places on their summer school and then had 200 people apply. So it means they've got this sort of larger control group than a treatment group. So it does really vary. Obviously, it's better if they're balanced in terms of numbers, but it's quite hard to achieve that. So it doesn't matter too much if they're uneven. The most important part is that they're oversubscribed enough so that you've got a large enough control group as well as a treatment group, because obviously if you're only sort of 5 students over, that's not going to provide a large enough control group.
Thanks, Sarah, that's great. I think we've got time for one more question. Just going to choose wisely. But there's a couple of questions about the type of test used. And I know Zara introduced both the ANCOVA and also the multiple linear regression. And obviously we've chosen to use an example of a t-test. So I just wanted to, I guess, kind of point out that we will be covering other forms of tests and also other types of analysis in future webinars. Without going into too much technical detail in the next couple of minutes, it's quite hard to explain the different sort of trade-offs that you have to make when thinking about the quality of your data, the volume of your data, and then also not just the statistical design, but the methodological design that you've been using as well. And it takes a little bit of time to unpick each of these questions. So I feel like we will do it more justice with more time in different webinars. But what I would do is encourage anyone who is asking kind of methodological or sample related questions in the chat box to drop us an email with topics that you would find it particularly useful for us to cover, because we do definitely kind of respond to that sector need, and we can conduct similar webinars to this, but on slightly differing methodologies in the future. And I think that probably just leaves it to me to wrap up. There isn't a whole lot more to say other than thank you all very much for joining us today early in the morning. And it's really great to have so many people attend. I think we had kind of 200 people register, and there's still sort of over 130 of you on this call. So thank you for joining, and it's great to have you all with us. Just to direct you to our evaluation guidance. So I think some of you will be familiar with this, but we go through the kind of general process of how TASO approaches evaluation in similar webinars on our website. So do visit that. And then equally, we have some interesting toolkit pages that cover the kind of rapid evidence review for different types of intervention used in the WP and student success space. And again, not only is it a summary of key evidence, but it actually does talk through some of the different methodologies used to produce that type 3 causal evidence. So do also visit that. And just to say that I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions. There's still lots of questions in the chat box, but do let us know if you have any further questions or need something answering, and we'll be very happy to help. So thank you all very much. It was great to see you, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.